Brothers and sisters and boys and girls, we know that families are a great blessing from the Lord. It's an appropriate day to reflect on that, given that it's called Father's Day today. But we don't just privilege fathers. Obviously, we have Mother's Day, too, a different time of the year. Fathers are important. Mothers are important. Although we don't have Children's Day, we do have Family Day, and we celebrate our children. And we celebrate all of our children. Imagine you just celebrated one of them. Do you ever favor your children? If you have children, or do you see other people favor their children? Celebrate one over the other? It's easy enough to do, if your personalities connect, if your interests connect, it could be that a parent favors a child. But that's not God's intention for families. And that can lead to serious conflict. And we see that in our text quite obviously, don't we? That conflict between the father and the son and the mother and the son, these favored children. It really is a messy family that we have before us this afternoon. A question, though, is it a believing family? It might be messy, but is it a believing family? Because, as we look at Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau, it's not good. We see weak faith. We see deception. We see misplaced loves. But what else do we see? We see the sovereignty of God. God had said, chapter 25, the one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. That's what he had said would happen. And then we saw in that same chapter that the birthright transfer had happened from the oldest to the youngest. And now at the end of Isaac's life, the blessing is going to the younger. And so what we see in this is that despite mixed motives and wrong moves and weak faith, God is sovereign to accomplish his will. That's our theme this afternoon. And as we look at the text more closely, again, as always, I encourage you to have your Bibles open to it. Isaac is old, right? That's where we begin. He's old, and he's blind, or he's mostly blind. His eyes were dim so that he could not see. He must be quite blind at the very least. His death is coming. His death is imminent. And so it's time to transfer the blessing. And that's a big deal, this idea of officially transferring the blessing to his next son. The blessing is the thing that distinguishes this family, right, from all the other families. That's how important it is. God spoke, and he spoke to Abraham, and by doing so, he selected Abraham out of the obscurity of his pagan existence. He plucked him out of that. And then presumably Abraham spoke to Isaac, his only son. It's kind of obvious, so we don't have a record necessarily of it. But God spoke to Isaac, affirming the blessing. We saw that last week in chapter 26. And now Isaac must speak to his son. And so he calls to his eldest. And he tells him what's going on, and he says, here's the instructions. Go out, take your weapons, go out to the field, and so on. Prepare this meal for me. I'm going to bless you. And it seems about right. It seems like a good conversation there that Isaac has with his son. But there's big problems with this, obviously. And we see that in verses 5 through 13. And it starts with this favoritism. It's interesting, the contrast. You see in verse 5 that Esau is referred to as his son. Isaac spoke to his son Esau, and then the very next verse, Rebekah said to her son Jacob. Also, Esau later is called her son too. But right now, the contrast in these verses shows the division, the rift that exists in this family because of these favored sons and the way the parents have handled that. And it all leads to this deception then that Rebekah plans. You see that in verses 8 through 10. We're familiar with it. We just read it. The plan. There's even bigger questions than this, though. God disapproves of deception. He disapproves of favoritism. That's all true. But this is not just a moral lesson on the dangers of those two things. That's not really the main question. The main question is, are these people of faith? Will the younger son indeed be blessed? And then with that, is God sovereign? Are these people of faith? Well, if we think back to, again, the story as we've just got into it, but also the chapters before that, which we left off some time ago with, We saw faith in these people. We saw faith in Rebekah when we were first introduced to her. She left her family. She was willing to travel all this way to come to be with Isaac. That took faith, especially the way she handled herself. When Rebekah was barren early on in their marriage, Isaac, what did he do? He prayed. He prayed through her barrenness. He didn't do anything like Abraham with Hagar. He prayed to the Lord. Shows faith. Rebekah, she inquired of the Lord when she had these two infants struggling within her. Remember, they're smashing up against each other is the literal language. And she says to the Lord, what's going on? She goes to the Lord. And then, yes, in chapter 26, we saw some struggle with fear and faith in this land of Gerar and the lack of obedience at first there. But overall, Isaac showed himself to be a man of faith and obedience. So younger Isaac, we could say, is a man of faith. And so is younger Rebekah. But now, Isaac is weak. And he's not just weak physically. He's weak spiritually. His eyes, rather, are dim spiritually. Right, that's how it says his eyes are dim. Why do I say that? Well, he loves his son Esau. He wants to bless him. But what about the prophecy? Right? That prophecy from chapter 25, which I just hinted at as well, read a quote from. Even if only Rebekah had heard this, and chapter 25 does say, and the Lord said to her, he still should have known that Esau is an ungodly man. And even if the despising of the birthright, that scene with Esau and Jacob, even if that was kept quiet, although it seems like it wasn't because Esau mentions here in verse 36, he took away my birthright, he's cheated me twice. Either way, Isaac still should have known, because his marriages weren't a secret. Remember how our reading began with those marriages to the Hittite women? Wicked Canaanite women. Now you might say, there's other people who married outside of Israel. What about Rahab? What about Ruth? Ruth was from Moab. Rahab was from Canaan, right? They were conquering Canaan, and that's where she came from. Yes, but that's different, because those two women showed loyalty to God and to his people in a very particular way. But the Hittites were explicitly called out by God. They were explicitly condemned as a people. All the way back in Genesis 15, God had spoken of the Hittites. He had listed them among the people who would be condemned for their wickedness. And Esau would have known this. He should have considered this. And he would have known further than that about Abraham's intentions for his dad, for Isaac. Beginning of chapter 24, we have this call from Abraham to his servant. That I may make you swear, come here, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son Isaac from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but you'll go to my country. So very clear in the history of this family. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing here, brothers and sisters, is that Esau is not on board. He's not on board with the family direction. He lacks commitment to the family vision. He doesn't see it. So rather than have his parents select an appropriate bride for him, he figures out his marriages on his own, and they're sinful marriages. The birthright doesn't matter to him. That's what we saw. The life that he's been called to doesn't matter to him. It's the second time this has come up, at the very least the second time. And yet he wants the blessing, and Isaac wants to give it to him. Why? Why does Isaac want to give him the blessing? Sidney Gray-Donis puts it this way, commentating on this passage. He says, Isaac, like Esau, is controlled by his appetite. If you look at the text of chapter 27, we see 8 times the use of the word game, 6 times the use of delicious food, and then repeated in verse 4 and verse 9 and verse 14, delicious food such as he loves, such as I love, Isaac says, Rebekah speaks, such as he loves your father. He loves this food. And that's controlling him, that feeling. His heart is bitter because of Esau's sinful actions and his lack of spiritual vitality. But he's also torn because he loves this man. He loves this impressive son of his who goes out and hunts and who brings back delicious food, delicious game, tasty food. So he lets his stomach guide him, the physical guide him, ignoring the spiritual. We could say that he's taking his eyes off the ball. He wants to give the blessing to his older son, but what is the goal? What is the ball? It is the blessing needs to go to the younger. And he's distracted from that. He takes his eye away from that. Have you ever done that? Have you ever done that? Where you should know, you should act, but you don't. Because of a motivation other than faithfulness to God. You want to do things this way rather than this way. That's what we're seeing. So Isaac is seeing dimly, yes, but in more ways than just one. And it's not just Isaac who has this spiritual eyesight problem. It is Rebekah too. Rebekah, we're told, loves Jacob. Again, remember, it's her son, she said, verse 6. And obviously Rebekah knows the prophecy. It was given to her most directly. So what's guiding her? Is it that prophecy? Is that why she's doing what she's doing? No, it's her love for Jacob. And that's why she's deceiving, and that's why she's exploitative here. She exploits her husband's vulnerabilities by instigating and coordinating this plan to deceive him. It's not godly. And the key to this is when Jacob shows hesitancy. Jacob says, what if I'm going to be cursed instead of blessed? What if this doesn't work out? And she says, it's okay, I'll take the curse on me. And as she says that, she's showing that she's more about her love for Jacob than her love for God's ways and his blessing. So Isaac, Rebekah, and then we have Jacob. Jacob agrees to the plan. Yes, there's the initial hesitancy, some fear, but he agrees to the plan. He lives up to his name, cheater or deceiver. And so as we look at this family, Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, Jacob, it's a messed up family. It's a family of messed up motives and flickering faith. Isaac might be the only one who's physically blind, but he's not the only one who's seeing dimly. And so then we ask the question, where is God in all of this? And the answer is, he's at work. He's at work. Again, that prophecy, chapter 25, verse 23, that the older will serve the younger, he's bringing it about. God is sovereign, brothers and sisters. And then when we think, well, how does that work with all of this deception and that? It doesn't mean that he approves of this. Jacob and Rebekah, they are responsible for their actions. Again, sovereignty and responsibility. We've seen this dynamic work itself out. Jacob is responsible for his actions, and so Jacob will suffer the consequences of his actions. He's deceiving his brother. He's going to become alienated from his brother because of it. And he's going to live this life on the run. And then he will be deceived before too long by his uncle, Laban. And also this, he will no longer be with his mom. This is it for them. Rebekah, she's done after this in the story. There's nothing noted about her. Her nurse's death is noted, but not hers. Although we do have one reference in chapter 49, verse 31, to her burial. She is given an honorable burial. She's still part of the covenant family in the tomb with the others. But God doesn't approve, is what we're saying here. And the responsibility for their actions leads to consequences. But that doesn't mean that he's not at work, because he is at work. And this is what he does. He always works, and he works through mixed actions to accomplish his will. And we've seen this in our own lives, and we've seen this in the history of this world which we live in. So the blessing comes to the younger son because that's what God had always intended. So that's what happens, verses 18 through 23. Though he's hesitant, Jacob goes along with it. You can see the hesitancy as he approaches his father. He says, "My father," and then he's silent. And then Isaac asks him, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am Esau, your firstborn." He puts forward the lie to see if it's going to catch. And Isaac doesn't buy it at first. "How is it that you found it so quickly, my son?" And you see the nerve of Jacob to even use the name of the Lord as part of his lie. "The Lord your God granted me success," verse 20. But Isaac still quite hasn't bought it, so the tension is growing here. Please come near so I can feel you. Are you really my son, Esau? It's Jacob's voice, Esau's hands. Are you really my son? And finally he smells his clothing. He feels him as well, and he's convinced. So he blesses him. See, the smell of my son is the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. What's the blessing? It's dominion. Dominion over land, dominion over people, nations, and it's prosperity. This is the blessing, and it's Jacob's now. It's fixed, it's firm, it's unalterable, it's his. It's been passed on, it's been transferred. And now Esau comes in. And Esau's such a different character than Jacob. He handles this so differently, right? There's no hesitation whatsoever. Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. And Isaac immediately realizes what happened, and he trembles violently. Literally, he's filled with intense fear and alarm. He panics. But it's too late. Verse 33, it's too late. He says, yes, and he shall be blessed. Because these words of blessing that have been spoken to Jacob are a firm and solemn oath. It's a covenantal oath. And it cannot be changed. So Esau's sad. He wants the blessing. He despised the birthright. He didn't have interest in that, but he wants the blessing. And he doesn't get it, and he can't get it. And we'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. But he only gets this mediocre at best blessing from Isaac, verses 39 through 40, a pale imitation of what his brother received. So he's not only sad, but he's mad. He is furious. I'm going to kill him, he says, verse 41. He wants to kill his brother. And it's only Rebekah's actions that prevent it. At least from a human point of view, it's only Rebekah's actions that prevent that from actually happening. She convinces Isaac, again, we see her craftiness. She convinces her husband, you know what, Jacob needs to get out of town. He needs to get a wife. Can't be from here. He's got to go back to the family. But even while she's still manipulating things in this way, to make it seem like it's Isaac's idea and not her own, still we see a glimmer of hope here, brothers and sisters. After all that's happened that's bad, it's not all bad. There is still faith in this family. There is still commitment to the Abrahamic vision. They still can see. And we see that through Isaac. We see that in verse 7. When Isaac says, come that I may bless you before the Lord. And we see it in verse 27. When he speaks of a field that the Lord has blessed. This is still yet a godly man acknowledging the Lord. And then we see it in the blessing, verses 28 through 29, that this is the Abrahamic blessing. This is, in substance, the same blessing. Isaac's familiar with it. And he's passing it on. And then again in chapter 28, as that chapter begins, he's imitating Abraham again when he sends Jacob to his own people to find a wife from among them rather than the Canaanites. And so Hebrews 11 verse 20 says, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Their faith is weak. In his old age, he's seeing dimly, and spiritually speaking, his vitality is not strong. His faith is weak, but it is still real. Now Esau, not so much. Esau, what does he do at the end of our text here, verses 6 and not through 9? He marries an Ishmaelite woman. He sees what his parents think about his other wives, the Hittites. It's not good. He sees how they sent Jacob off to pattern around to find a wife. And so he marries a descendant of Ishmael. Not a Hittite, but a descendant of Abraham. But again, it's a pale imitation of his brother and what he's doing. Now, Esau's not necessarily a bad guy, as we use those words. He's somewhat impressive, in fact, to some people, right? Just like Isaac figures he's impressive. Later, Esau's even going to forgive Jacob, and we would say that's good, wouldn't we? That's a good thing. But he doesn't see He doesn't get it. He lacks any spiritual insight. He is blind to the ways of God. Esau wants the blessing, but he doesn't want the birthright. What's the difference? Well, the birthright is the inheritance, basically, to be the head of the family. And there's a responsibility that comes with that, to continue the family direction and carry out that family direction. And Esau didn't want that. He wanted the good things, but he didn't want what came with it. He wanted the gift, but he didn't want the responsibility. But the blessing only comes through the birthright. And so that brings us to you and me. How badly do you want the blessing? Do you also desire the birthright? Do you desire to be a member of the family? To have this inheritance? See, the birthright is through faith in Jesus, through faith alone in Jesus. That's what we're called to. That's what we're obliged to, faith. John 1 verse 12 says, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. So it's about faith in Jesus, but faith can be hard. If you think of Israel, what are they like right now as they hear this, as they hear this story originally? Well, they're surrounded by enemies still. Edom is an arch enemy. Edom coming from Esau. And so regardless of what time period exactly Israel's hearing this at, they're not fully experiencing the blessings of the promised land. All of that dominion, all of that prosperity that we just spoke of with the Abrahamic blessing, they're not fully experiencing that. They just have the birthright and this call to faith. What about us? We don't fully experience all the blessings either. We experience tragic loss of life too early, we would say sometimes. We experience health struggles. We experience work struggles. We experience relationship struggles. We struggle against sin. We haven't fully experienced all the blessing yet. But we have the birthright. So we have to look to Christ in faith. That's the calling for us as well. The point of this passage for Israel, and then also the point of this passage for you and me, is that God is accomplishing his will. Despite all that's going on, he's doing it. And you can be assured of that. But then the question is, do you have the eyes to see? And then walk accordingly. See, God is not surprised by how this played out with Jacob and Esau and Rebekah and Isaac. God is not surprised by the Israelites' enemies and their actions. Psalm 83, verses 5 and 6, the psalmist says, for they conspire with one accord. Against you they make a covenant, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites. There you have Esau and Ishmael together conspiring against Israel, God's people. And that makes us think of Psalm 2 in this language of the nations and the kings conspiring against the Lord and against his anointed, his son. But how does that psalm end? It says, true and lasting blessing is found only in the Son. Those who take refuge in him, they're the blessed ones. And that's, of course, Jesus. Jesus. God is not surprised by the enemy, and he's doing something about it. That's the message to Israel, and then from our perspective, he's done something about it. And so we look at this as New Covenant Christians, and we can look at it like the apostles do. Acts chapter 4, the apostles were released from prison, and they speak to the people, and they're quoting Psalm 2. And they say, the kings and the nations conspire. Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Romans, the Jews, they conspired against Jesus. And we know the deception that was a part of that, right? And then Acts 4, verse 28, while they're praying to God, they say, they did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. Do you see it? Deception, yes. But through the deception, God worked to bless his people. But this blessing is only for those who have eyes to see. Apart from Jesus, you and I are like Esau. Hebrews 12 gives us this warning. See that no one is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. And so it's the same for us. Same for everybody who's living right now. There will come a time when it will be too late, and judgment will be here, and curse will be here for all who are like Esau. So in conclusion, brothers and sisters, we have to say that all that matters is his blessing. That's it. And our faith may be weak, like Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob. We might have some mixed motives at times, but our righteousness is not enough anyways. That's why we constantly need to look to him in faith and cling to his righteousness. Because you see, Jacob is putting on his elder brother's clothes in order to get the blessing from his father. But your elder brother, Jesus, gives you his clothes. And so you can receive the blessing from your Father. He clothes you in his righteousness. And so those who see him are the blessed ones. We are those who have been given eyes to see by his Spirit. Praise God. And so we are those who walk by faith and not by sight. We are those who hold on to his promise that although now we see in a mirror dimly, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Amen.